expression eventually in the norms and rules of society. And so also we may see pressing issues at the global level and realize that the nature of the solution to those issues may also have application in our individual lives. The subject tonight, as you know, is women and peace. And the subject of peace is inextricably related to the question of war. I think it is the relationship between peace and war that is causing us a great deal of ongoing difficulty. In fact, we have been much more interested in war than we have been in peace. If you look, for instance, in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you will see that there are 60 pages devoted to war, and there is no entry under the subject peace. We live in a world in which our leaders proclaim their devotion to peace, but are continually increasing their preparations for war. It is interesting in this light to read a passage that Abdu'l-Baha wrote over 100 years ago in his treatise, The Secret of Divine Civilization, which was written anonymously to the people of Persia to give them advice on how to improve the management of their country. Abdu'l-Baha wrote, There is the well-known case of the ruler who is fostering peace and tranquility and at the same time devoting more energy than the warmongers to the accumulation of weapons and the building up of a larger army on the grounds that peace and harmony can only be brought about by force. Peace is the pretext, and night and day they are all straining every nerve to pile up more weapons of war, and to pay for this their wretched people must sacrifice most of whatever they are able to earn by their sweat and toil. Every day they invent a new bomb or explosive. The staggering cost of it all must be borne by the hapless masses. Does that sound familiar? 100 years later? We've gone through 2 world wars, but the situation, if anything, is worse than anything that has been seen before in the history of mankind. We are spending more of our total resources on war preparations than mankind has ever seen. In fact, recent data that has become available will show that the amount that is being spent on war in the world is at least as large as the value of the total production of the half of mankind that is in the poorest category. In other words, to put it another way, if we could redirect the resources that are spent on war, we could easily double the resources available to uplift the suffering of the downtrodden half of mankind, 2.5 billion human souls. And this obviously is one of the greatest and is an ongoing crime against humanity, according to any standards of justice and equity. And we know in the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, not only the passage I just cited, that he frequently linked the issue of the cost of war with the danger of having those weapons. You know, it was a new thought, I think, for many of us that a nuclear holocaust could so change the climate and bring about a nuclear winter that everyone in the world would be affected, even countries far distant from the area of conflict. But in fact, in the economic realm, even if we never use these weapons, everyone in the world is paying the cost, because in the economic realm, the world is deeply interconnected. And in the words of a recent New York Times editorial, this interdependence is becoming daily more apparent. This economic dislocation from the tremendous burden of war preparations and expenditures affects everyone, everywhere, all the time, and is thus both an immediate and a truly global issue.
In Sierra Leone, where we spent the last 2 years, the imminence of a nuclear war seemed rather remote. It was like a nasty genie conjured up by the great powers to distract thinking people from the real problems of hunger and disease and poverty which were in the third world countries. I tried organizing a peace forum while I was teaching at the University of Furua Bay. And while I was doing this and talking to my students about it, one of my students quite frankly said to me, this is completely irrelevant here. He said, first you enslave us, then you colonize us, then you keep us forever in debt, and now you want us to adopt all your nuclear fears and nightmares. Well, he said, go ahead and annihilate yourselves. Why drag us into it? I had to admit there was some logic in what he said. I tried to explain to him what the New York Times editorialist had said, as my husband was pointing out, and he saw that point. But I must say I learnt far more from him than I think he did from the peace conference that we had there. I learnt that the word peace meant something much larger than what I had assumed it meant when I was living in the West. I realized that the immediate problems facing 2/3 of mankind were very basic. In Sierra Leone, they need rice, they need palm oil, they needed petrol to keep the cars going, they needed kerosene. The hospitals had no water, the schools had no textbooks. When you saw the queues, the 3-day lineups, the haggard patience of women, the misery of the children in the dust, you realized this was a country at war. It was enduring war conditions, far worse possibly than some of those experienced in European countries during the Second World War. Peace did not mean the same thing in Sierra Leone as it does to most of us in North America. It was not just a negative alternative to war, but a positive alternative of social progress, of material and spiritual well-being. Peace simply meant a decent place to live, a decent place to grow up, a place to learn. A way of grasping this idea, I suppose, from a feminist perspective, would be to look at the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and particularly a letter I found written by his secretary in 1939, addressed to women, or rather on the subject of women. It's about the conditions conducive to a child's welfare and advancement. The task of bringing up a Baha'i child, as emphasized time and again in Baha'i writings, is the chief responsibility of the mother, whose unique privilege is indeed to create in her home such conditions as would be most conducive to both his material and spiritual well-being, welfare and advancement. It occurred to me that most of the human race is enduring conditions that are not the least bit conducive to either material or spiritual well-being. And that if I could see with the eyes of a universal mother, I would be weeping at the plight of the children of men. It's precisely under such impossible conditions that we're trying to raise and carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. The children of men are growing up everywhere, accustomed to hunger and poverty and terrorism. They're surrounded by obscenities and strife. They're deprived of a sense of future and have lost all respect for the past. The conditions that are prevailing in this home of our planet are surely appalling to us if we think of ourselves all as mothers. Shouldn't we, women, whose chief responsibility it is to raise children, begin to claim our true rights, claim our privileges, in the words of Shoghi Effendi's letter? Clearly, as he points out, the responsibility we have as mothers gives us the privilege to claim that right. It's really up to us to create some order in the home.
But order in the home and the health of the family, the provision of the basic needs of life, are all related to the general economic conditions of society. And their attainment has to be in the context of the available material means. So societies such as Sierra Leone, in which we have just spent 2 years, where those material means are not adequate, require development. And it seems to me that the question of international development, in other words, the bringing about of greater equality between nations, has its parallels to the development of women and the bringing about of greater equality between the sexes. In its message to the Baha'is of the world on social and economic development, dated October 20th, 1983, the Universal House of Justice emphasized the importance which Baha'u'llah attached to the preservation of human honor, and indicated that progress in the development field will largely depend on natural stirrings at the grassroots, and it should receive its driving force from those sources rather than from an imposition of plans and programs from the top. Unfortunately, the official development effort of the last few decades has been generally characterized by an imposition of the ideas, attitudes, and plans of the donors or the planning agencies on the recipient populations. And this contrasts with what the Universal House of Justice urges us to emphasize the objectives of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, or what is currently popularly called self-help. In other words, human dignity and honor are essential parts of successful development. But human dignity, emphasis on human dignity and self-reliance does not imply, either for the individual or for nations, that they be insular. We can have interdependence without dependency. It's really a question of attitudes. At the international level, a powerful nation can bully and subjugate other nations, or it can choose to treat them with a certain degree of respect and a sense of their proper place in the community of nations. We all know that in democratic societies we place great emphasis on the rights of the individual, including the very important political right to vote. And these rights of the individual are considered a bedrock of these societies and the great advantage of these societies as compared with totalitarian systems. In the same way, in the world, the smaller nations need to have their rights safeguarded. And not until all nations of all sizes can support a system which safeguards the rights of all can we expect to have peace in the world. Something like the same issues face women. The struggle for economic equality is particularly obvious because it can be quantified. And it is clear that in an economic struggle, those who are disadvantaged can never overcome or overtake those that are ahead purely on the basis of an economic confrontation. It would be like putting you or me in a boxing ring with a prize fighter and calling it an equal match. And internationally, we see that the gap between the rich nations and the poor nations continues to grow in the current free-for-all system. In other words, the rules of the game themselves have to be changed. And the rich as well as the poor must realize that it is to everyone's longer-term advantage to create a system in which the rights of the less advantaged are protected. It is in some ways parallel to the equal access to opportunities and to education which have been provided gradually to women in the Western world and has allowed them slowly to upgrade their educational and professional level and enter increasingly into fields that had previously been reserved to men. For women, as in developing societies, a sense of honor, dignity, and self-worth can more easily develop on a foundation of self-reliance, and that is related to economic realities. In other words, it is important that women have access to the skills and the means to earn a living. And even if they choose for a period of their lives to devote themselves full-time to raising a family and creating a home, these activities should be accorded the honor and status that they deserve. Fortunately, there are also some technical innovations and a growing awareness of these problems that may increasingly allow employers to offer part-time or flexible employment to women. It's interesting that in the newly prepared and released compilation on women from the Baha'i World Center, the section entitled Women in the World at Large begins with this well-known hidden word of Baha'u'llah. O my servants, Baha'u'llah writes, ye are the trees of my garden. Ye must give forth goodly and wondrous fruits, that ye yourselves and others may profit therefrom. Thus it is incumbent on everyone to engage in crafts and professions, for therein lies the secret of wealth. Here we see the image of bearing fruit, which is traditionally associated with women and fecundity, directly linked by Baha'u'llah with the pursuit of crafts and professions, which traditionally have always been associated with men. We're not yet, however, at the stage of equality, and in this transition period, it is essential that men's attitude toward women reflects a sense of equality and the respect that flows from such an awareness. It is this same quality of respect which Baha'u'llah calls upon us to have towards all people. He wrote, know ye not why we created you from the same dust, why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how ye were created.
It's very easy to always be grumbling about somebody else's attitudes towards you. The most difficult thing is to surmount your own attitudes towards yourself. Our traditional attitude towards ourselves as women has often been in terms of our ability to be mothers. What's new, I think, in this century is that for the first time we have to be our own mothers. We don't only have children, but we have to see that we ourselves, as women, are growing up. We're confronted with the task not only of raising them, but of raising ourselves at the same time.